we'll begin with our lunch keynote speakers, Darren and Karen from the Gabriel Dumont Institute. I had the pleasure of meeting both of them over breakfast when I was out in Saskatoon this summer. And we got talking a bit about the Metis Treaties project, and they invited me over back to the Gabriel Dumont Institute, which is more than just an institute. It's actually a museum. There's an incredible history of Metis there in the institute. So it's a museum, it's an institute, it's a publisher, it's many things. And I got thinking that it'd be great to connect with them in terms of furthering the project on the Metis Treaties. So with that, I would welcome Darren and Karen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm standing. Thank you, Marcy, Larry, for the invitation, and the organizing committee. You're doing a great job here. And we're very honored to have our publication chosen as the gift, too. We've also had the honor of listening to the great presentations and dialogue which has taken place here at the conference. I've loved the diversity of ideas and thoughts that have been shared here. I must tell you a little bit about the Gabriel Dumont Institute to provide a little background. We like to think we're well known, but we're not, particularly on the days when someone telephones and asks to speak to Gabriel. So, but I'm going to do it in a Métis way, and that's by telling you a story. Our stories aren't just our oral histories; they're teaching mechanisms. They are the way we transmit the culture from one person to the next and one generation to the next. And I'm going to build on some of the thoughts that have been shared here over the last few days. And I was particularly struck by Paul Chartrand's comment that a people emerge from political action. So I'm going to go through some of those actions as I tell the story. And I'm going to go through an individual political action. I guess I call that with the small p. I became the pawn in a game that my mom was playing with the school, because way back in the day, and I think it continued long into the time still when I was a classroom teacher, when you registered for school in the fall, you had to put down your ethnic origin. And my mother would write Canadian down, and I would take that form back to school. And the teacher would kind of sigh and go, "This isn't what we meant. Take this form back and get it filled out properly." So I would do that. I would bring that form back home. And I'd say, "Mom, the teacher said you didn't fill this form out right and that she wants you to do it again." My mom would tap her finger on it and she'd say, "I did so fill it out right. You take this back the way it is." So I would do that, and I didn't. Unfortunately, my mom passed away when she was relatively young, and I didn't get a chance to ask her all this stuff that I wanted to know, but I didn't know if she was asserting that we were more Canadians than other people, but I think that there was probably twofold. It was that, as well as she did not want to give them the opportunity to further marginalize her children. Because if you said you were an Aboriginal person in those days, you would be streamed off into probably modified ed or into maybe, what do they call that, commercial or industrial kind of programs. And even socioeconomically, we were already marginalized in the neighborhood that we lived in. The kids who graduated from elementary school had to go to the technical vocational high school. And I kept telling myself, I thought, I don't want to be a hairdresser or a secretary, so in order to go to the academic school, you had to have a special letter and a high average, and I had planned to do that, but just when we were going to go to high school, they closed down that building and they said, "Okay, all of you kids have to pick another high school to go to." So I chose the one I wanted to go to in the first place, but I keep thinking how awful that is, that just because of where we lived and what they thought our background was, they had our futures all laid out for us. And I always say that had we been walking down the street and someone said, "Oh, look at that poor family," we would have been gawking around trying to see who they were, because we sure didn't think it was us. And it's a relative term. And if you're, rich in culture and rich in love, you're not going to see yourself as a poor person. So that's one of the stories. And so I think that has to do with that political action of my mom taking the action that she could at that time. That gave me, I guess, a lot of fortitude for some of the stupid questions I got as life rolled along, such as, how Métis are you? That's one that gets under my skin. But I was at a family function, and my nephew from my brother-in-law's, he ran up to me and he said, "You're part Indian." And I looked at him and I said, "Yes, but do you know which part?" And he kind of looked at me, and then he ran away. And I thought, well, I got him good now. He's just going to go play and he'll forget all about this. But a half an hour later, he came up and he had a very earnest look in his eyes. And he looked up at me and he said, "Which part?" And I went like this, and I pointed to my heart. And he went, "Oh, okay." And I thought, why is that a good enough answer for him, but it's not good enough for anyone else? And so I guess that's one about me asserting who I think I am as a Métis woman. Back to some of the stories about GDI. And one more thing about my mother is I consider this subversive political action too, because if you're making sure that your kids know their ancestors are Métis from the Red River and taking them back to where you're born and raised in a one-room log cabin, and taking them to Batoche when it's not even a park or a place to visit, I think that's political action to say, you're not going to get this history anywhere else, so I'm going to give it to you. I was also very fortunate to go to the Trappers Festival in the Pas, Manitoba with my mom when I was about 11. And we went down to the river, and my mom was talking to people that she knew because she had lived there as a teenager. And I heard her ask someone if she could borrow their snowshoes. So next thing I know, my mom's in the women's snowshoe race, and my mom won. And I'm going, my mom can run, and she's old. She's 31. Anyways, that was our trip to Disneyland. I mean, that meant more to us than if we'd have spent thousands and thousands going to Disneyland. So again, it's making sure that we had those cultural things to do. The next kind of political action is grassroots action, and a good example here is, and in case you didn't know, the Métis in Saskatchewan only had access to public education as late as the 1940s, because in order to go to public school you had to be a taxpayer, and because of the marginalization and poverty that our people experienced after 1885, we didn't own land for the most part and therefore didn't pay taxes. So we truly became Canada's forgotten people, and especially when it came to education. So the grassroots movement occurred in 1976 at a cultural conference in Saskatoon, when the people attending there, and this would be elders and community people, they said, we need something for our people so that we don't lose our culture, and so that our children get to have the advantage of having an education and employment. And we need something to happen to make that happen. And so that was where the seed was planted for the Gabriel Dumont Institute to become an entity that would take care of that role. And by 1980, when it was founded, that's what happened. It has a dual mission. So I like that holistic approach too, that I would say is traditional, where it has the one part, which is the education and training of Métis people through the delivery of Métis-specific programs, and then the preservation and promotion of Métis history and culture. And that's the part that Darren and I get to work in, so we kind of consider ourselves the lucky ones there. Anyways, the other story again about grassroots is the story that Marilyn shared yesterday about the wheelbarrows of nickels and dimes that were sent back, because too often we're appeased with minimal funding that keeps us quiet but keeps our wheels spinning at the same time. And I think that was a real good indicator that we wanted more than to be appeased. And as Marilyn was telling that story, I was thinking, hey, a wheelbarrow full of change. It was the modern Red River cart of change. And so it was a catalyst for us to be properly funded. Although it was very tight times, because in the early days of the Institute, and Darren can attest to this, when we used to go to meetings at hotels, we would take the pens and pads of paper there so that we'd have some back at the office. Like the Métis are sometimes called the 1.5 men. Well, we joke around that we're the 1.5 employees because we have to do probably a big stretch. You get your skills stretched too, and that's a good thing, but you have to do a lot of work. You don't have a balkanized workforce of somebody to lick the stamp and someone that buys it and someone that applies it and someone that drops it in the mailbox. It's start to finish done usually by one or just a few people. And then, of course, the organized kind of political action where the Métis nations of the provincial Métis Nation organizations and the national organization have really, I think, put in a good effort to try to have us recognized. And, of course, we do pay homage to people like Harry Daniels for that. I meant to start this show. It has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but they're really interesting. And you'll see interesting images, and you'll see we're very proud to have the world's largest collection of art by Christy Belcourt. And so you'll see some of the images that we have in that collection, and we'll be having cultural workshops in there. And we're very careful with the art too. We are using gallery quality practices to take care of it so that it'll be here for many, many more generations. So over the 35 years that we're celebrating this year of GDI being around, it's really grown a lot. One of the flagship programs was the SUNTEP program, Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program, which drew usually people that were a little older. This was their first chance really to get to take any post-secondary education. And for many, they didn't want to necessarily be a teacher, but it was a segue to show that you could cut it at university. And then many of them went on to other roles, law or be a professor in a certain academic field. It's kind of still like that. I think I'll be glad when this day ends, but that when headhunters want educated Métis, and they're not really too particular about what they graduated from, just that they prove that they could do it. And so when there's enough of us educated that they can be more particular, I'll be very happy about that. But SUNTEP has had a very important role. It now represents something like 10% of the teaching force in Saskatchewan. It's graduated over 1,100 teachers with a Bachelor of Education from affiliation agreements either with the University of Saskatchewan or the University of Regina. Unfortunately, it was called out a few times as being substandard. So out of all the education programs that exist in Saskatchewan for teacher training, it has been reviewed 4 times, and each time it's been proven to be a superior program because of that cross-cultural component that is in it. And so our teachers are up to par, in fact, and even surpass in many ways some of the other teachers and the programs that they emerge from. It originally, I think, was so that Métis kids could see a role model and aspire, I could be that when I grow up. Things have changed so that in addition to that role, those teachers are showing non-Aboriginal students and their families and in school administration that Métis people are very capable. And there's been a number of barriers broken with school administration and superintendents also being Métis people. And so, you see now after 35 years, we're actually into the 3rd generation of people taking SUNTEP, and it breaks a cycle where the person was usually a single parent living at or below the poverty line and sometimes dependent on social assistance. That cycle gets broken, and within 4 years, whatever has been invested in their education is paid back by them working and paying taxes and spending their money on the kind of things that everyone else does. Okay. I wanted to make another point too, which was that we've never lowered the bar. What GDI has done, I think, to its credit and to also the credit of the students that come through, we do take whatever steps are necessary to get the student to the bar. Because if you've been out of school, you maybe went to grade 9 or 10, and you've been out of school for 5 or 6 years, you need a refresher course. And then the other thing is, again, systemically, because of this marginalization, things like math and science were not deemed the kind of subjects that we should be taking anyway. So we invented, this is where innovation comes in. I think it was Natalie that talked about innovation. By creating courses that really don't have any credit to them, like 80 and 90 courses, and the school year would be longer, but we would get the students ready to take that 100 level class by giving them 80 and 90 classes so that they would refresh their skills and be able to handle those classes. So the majority of the classes taken through the Bachelor of Education program are the same as the students in the regular College of Education take, and so we don't really find any need to defend ourselves. I guess Jennifer spoke about perspective. One thing that we do not apologize for at the Institute is to bring the Métis perspective to what we're doing. We must add what is missing in the history books, and I like to remind, well, anyone who will listen, that the last 5 letters in history is story. And a lot of times it depends on who gets to tell it, and usually that's the people in power, and so they're aggrandizing their own efforts and seeing things from a certain perspective. And we're not asking to sanitize or revise history. What we want is a more comprehensive view of it, critical thinking skills taught, so that people can assess the history from an informed perspective. What does GDI do besides teacher training? Well, we have, one of the innovative things that we did was to deliver community-based education long before it's quite common now. But in those days, we realized that the capacity was out in our communities, but that people found the travel and the expense and the loneliness of being away from home almost, they were great barriers for them. So we started the community-based delivery, and this year we have programs going on in over 20 communities. We can start right anywhere, right at pre-literacy, adult basic education, GED, adult 12s, skills training, certificate and diploma programs, which we deliver through what used to be called SIAS. It's called Sask Polytechnique now, and the regional colleges. We have apprenticeship program that actually we have more employers want apprentices from our programs than we have people that are in taking the programs. That's a good sign. So it's successfully led to employment for most of the apprentices. And we have an undergraduate program in fields outside of education through Gabriel Dumont College. It's a virtual college. That was innovative. We had no campus. We had no staff. But we undertook to give that college a name and to deliver arts and science and other discipline training through there, anything undergraduate that's outside of teacher education. And then through the Napolifontaine Scholarship Foundation, it has expanded to include graduate level scholarships. So there's been another glass ceiling broken for people that want to go on. We're building capacity because Métis people, I guess, should be represented throughout all disciplines and all workforces. We're not quite there yet, but when you have them in those positions, they add the advocacy and leadership and Métis perspective that actually is that foot in for hiring more Métis. Everyone knows about that buddy system of, who gets hired because you know someone. Okay. We have been making our resources, and Darren's going to go into more detail than I am about that, to indigenize. That's a hot word right now, indigenize. Well, I think Métis should become one as well. We Métis the curricula by making these resources, and again, it's our stories. It's from our perspective. We're Métisizing the workforce. We're providing role models, advocates, leaders. Our main job is cultural retention and renewal, because if the people from settler backgrounds have countries of origin where they can go and get in touch with their language and culture. Indigenous peoples of Canada do not have that. If it is lost and assimilated, there's no place to go back to get it. And so I guess we see ourselves as having a major role there, and of making a repository of that, those lost stories, those lost histories, and that language like Michif, so that it'll be there for everyone. I like to think of the work we're doing as legacy work. I sound sometimes kind of, guffaw and ask myself, is that kind of hokey what you're saying to the staff? But I really want people there that think of this as legacy work and not just a job. And so we have a very dedicated staff, and you'll see that when Darren has his turn to speak. I think I'll go back to what Chris Anderson, Anderson said, the failure to act honorably. And so when I think about that failure that the Canadian government has done to the Métis people, it's our job, and it's their job to respond and to support our heritage, our ancestors, our children, and our future. That has not been honorable to date. I'll never believe that Bernard Valcourt said this. He had a very clever staffer, hopefully a Métis one, who said that reconciliation is not to forgive and forget, but to remember and change. Couldn't have been him, right? But I like the phrase. And then I looked at the TRC findings, and it says we have to restore what must be restored, repair what must be repaired, and return what must be returned. And I hope that the Gabriel Dumont Institute is at least adding to that in some way. So I'll turn it over to Darren, my esteemed colleague.
Yes, please. Tanché. Salut tout le monde. Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Larry and all the organizers for this wonderful conference. I'd also like to thank all the participants. I've really learned a lot, and that's been really good for me professionally. And I was also glad to come because I see so many familiar faces here, and it was nice to reconnect. So I'm very happy, and I'm glad that I'm a participant in this conference. I'm going to be talking today about the Gabriel Dumont Institute Publishing Department, where both Karen and I work. And I'm also going to be talking about our virtual Museum of Métis History and Culture. So I will begin. With operations in Saskatoon, GDI's publishing department is an award-winning nonprofit book publisher, a curriculum development unit, a research unit, a cultural resource center, an archival depository, an art gallery, and an artifact curatorial center. When Karen said we wear many hats, we actually do. We're involved with the Museums Association, the Archives, Provincial Archives lobby in Saskatchewan, the publishing lobby, so we do a lot of different things in the Institute. And for me, personally and professionally, it's been wonderful because I like eclectic things, and I like the fact that our job is very eclectic, and we're involved with all sorts of creative people, both in NGOs and in the community, which is our real strength. Since 1985, the GDI Publishing Department has produced more than 170 Métis-specific literary, cultural, and educational resources. GDI is the only Canadian publisher that exclusively publishes Métis authors and illustrators and/or themes in a wide range of genres: illustrated children's books, graphic novels, prose and poetry books, juvenile and adult nonfiction trade, and academic books. Our eclectic Métis Centre books promote literacy and Métis history and culture for young readers. They also ensure the intergenerational transmission of Métis culture. The GDI Publishing Department office also contains a large and varied Métis-specific art and artifact collection. The space is steeped in Métis culture and history. This ambient setting has a definite impact on our publishing operations. The museum and gallery are used as venues for book launches and cultural programming relating to books, such as our various teacher workshops. And this is one of the real fun programs we have. The publishing department has an active Michif program. As part of our cultural mandate to preserve and promote Michif, most of our books include Michif components. The Michif language production includes online, app, and print-based dictionaries. Michif content from these resources are used in our books and cultural programs. More importantly, Michif translations and narrations are included in all of our children's books. So when you buy a Gabriel Dumont Institute children's book, there's a narration CD in a Michif language. That's in every children's book we produce. This culturally relevant add-on from the Michif program helps ensure Michif's intergenerational transmission. The publishing department also has an ongoing Métis oral history program. Oral histories form the basis of many of our projects and are one of the anchors of our online archival depository, the Virtual Museum of Métis History and Culture. GDI is presently working on a large oral history project, the Rhodolance people of Saskatchewan. Approximately 25 interviews with 40 former residents have been conducted by the Institute for this project. And one of the things that I found really interesting, editing the interviews, is going back to them and looking at all the commonalities of the culture for the Rhodolance people, particularly for the Michif Rhodolance people. Names of medicines and everything were the same, whether that was in the Souris Valley by Estevan, Saskatchewan, in the southeast corner, going all the way to where Chris's roots are in the Parkland area by Debden. They used the medicines and everything all had the same name. For instance, mint tea, the old people all called it liboum. So it was really interesting to see that Michif connection from the very bottom of the province going up through the center and reaching into the Parkland areas. So that was one of the really interesting things I found. So I hope that when the project comes out, more of this information can be shared. GDI's publishing department is working to publish a number of books coming in the next year and a half, I hope, but maybe 2 years. Rhodolance Kitten, which will be a children's book. Stories of Our People comic books, which will be a reformatting of our graphic novel of traditional Métis stories into individual comics. It includes stories about Le Diable, that for those of a francophone bet, that's the Michif version of Le Diable, the devil. Tijan, which is a mix of the French-Canadian Tijan with the Algonquian, Wissahicketchek, and Nanabush. And Rougarou, which is an adaptation of the old Loup-garou from these parts, from French Canada. We're also going to publish Women of the Métis Nation, a biographical anthology of Métis women. Red Sun, Gabriel Dumont, an innovative biography of Dumont by Chuck Thompson. Métis Prose and Poetry anthology, which will be edited, annotated, and compiled by renowned Métis poet Gregory Schofield, and prose writer and English professor Warren Carrio. Rhodolance People of Saskatchewan, that's where those oral histories are going to come in. It's a book we hope to publish in the next few years, and it'll include a map and community profiles of various Rhodolance communities in Saskatchewan, and it'll be based mostly in oral history. I think all told, I have about 170 Rhodolance communities in Saskatchewan. It's probably the tip of the iceberg, but it's a lot more than I thought going into it. And I cross-referenced a lot of stuff that was in the social welfare files at the Saskatchewan Archives Board. Also what Laurie Barron collected for Walking in Indian Moccasins, which is a real good book about the CCF's Métis and First Nations policy. And of course, oral history. And this one is going to be a real good legacy project because some of the old people or elders have passed on since the interviews have been conducted, so that's going to be a great book for community people. And then we're also working on an Olive Dickinson biography, and which will contain numerous interviews and will include papers, photographs, and ephemera from the Olive Dickinson collection, which was graciously donated to the Institute by Olive Dickinson's 3 daughters, Anne, Claire, Roberta, as well as another researcher by the name of Christine Durnois. And Tony was interviewed by Anne Dickinson for this project, so Tony's interview will be in that book sometime down the line. I will now talk about the Virtual Museum of Métis History and Culture. Would you mind doing that? The Virtual Museum of Métis History and Culture is GDI's multifaceted multimedia website dedicated to the preservation and promotion of Métis history and culture. The website is the most comprehensive attempt to chronicle traditional Métis history and culture on the World Wide Web and contains more than 500 primary, secondary documents, oral histories, essays, learning resources, photographs, and various archival documents in visual, audio, and video files. The Virtual Museum was founded in 2003, but work on it began in 2001. And last spring, we updated the website's interface following a thorough streamlining. The website is much more user-friendly for tablet and smart user phones. So this is the new design you're seeing, but we incorporated some of the old look into it. The Virtual Museum ensures that the Métis have a user-friendly, free, and accessible medium to tell their stories. We feel that it is imperative to continually augment our vast online repository of Métis-specific photographs, oral histories, antique books, and older learning resources and primary documents. The Virtual Museum serves as a user-friendly adjunct to our museum and archival collections. 3 key features on the website are our unique community resources, including family photographs, such as the Lawrence Arnault collection, the Dennis and Jean Fisher artifact collection, and our repository of Michif interviews and resources. By digitizing our Métis-specific archival collection, GDI was able to provide researchers and community people with easier access to our collections. Doing this also informs and shapes opinion on Métis history and culture. For instance, we know various provincial and federal government bureaucracies use the website thanks to online tracking via Google Analytics. And you know what else is interesting, Nick? When we can get the IP addresses and that, I see the U.S. government, U.S. Army, they've been looking at our website, so not the CIA, but but anyway. But they likely are. With approximately 3,500 to 6,000 unique visitors per month, people throughout the world use and appreciate the Institute's vast archival collection. To analyze how the website is used, we use Google Analytics, which allows us to see how users use the website in real time, and it even breaks down the amount of users who are using the site via desktop computers or smartphones and tablets. So I can go on the real time and I could see someone in Germany is on an iPad looking at the website, which is kind of cool. That could have a negative application, I suppose, if we were a nefarious organization, but we're not. Work on the Virtual Museum is continual. As I said earlier, there are about almost 1,300 resources on the website. In the near future, GDI hopes to add several thousand more from our archives, including the Senator John Boucher papers and the Olive Dickinson collection and others. Senator John Boucher was a very interesting fellow. He was one of our elders from St. Louis, Saskatchewan, which is around Batoche, just north of Saskatoon. And he met Nelson Mandela, and he is the gentleman who put the Métis sash around Nelson Mandela's waist. So Nelson Mandela, the world's hero, actually had a Métis sash and wore it when he came to Canada. So and that was a result of our elder and senator for both the Métis Nation, Saskatchewan, and Métis National Council, Senator John Boucher. The Institute is also working on a copyright policy, and this was troubling for us because when we first started the Virtual Museum, we put stuff on there under the hope that people would use it, and other publishers and organizations would contact us to use images in that. But we've developed a policy where we're now the keeper of the website, of the community images and the cultural knowledge. And while things like the essays and oral histories can be used by anybody, photographs we don't let anyone use. If you're a community person and your ancestors in the photograph, we'll allow you to use that photograph and make you a copy. But if another publisher who's publishing a book, say by Thomas Flanagan, or somebody wants to use a Métis-specific image or an image that we feel will go in a book that might be contrary to Métis rights, we won't work with them. So for the most part, we won't allow people to reuse community images, but the information on there, the oral histories and that can be used by anybody, of course, because we were getting so many requests, probably 200 requests a year to use images, and to police all that and keep track of that. It was a hard task, and this is just a way for us to protect our community people and their interests. One other interesting aspect about the website is that a lot of the oral histories and other primary documents have been used in thesis published across Canada. So a lot of times when I download a thesis, I'll read it, and then lo and behold, they're using our oral histories or something that I may have worked on in the past with our friend Laurie Barkwell, or even you, Nick. It's being used, and I kind of get tickled when I see that, or if they're using, say, Harriet Oakes' interview that we did, because I know Harriet quite well, and to see it being used. So that's one of the good things. The website's resources have also been quoted in books from across Canada. The world's largest Métis oral history collection is housed in the Virtual Museum. If I had to guess how many Métis oral histories we have on there, I would say between 500 and 700, and they're growing. These oral histories are often used in our books and cultural resources. Other times, a series of interviews are conducted for a specific book, partnership, or cultural resource. Over time, these interviews are put on the Virtual Museum. Now, our policy is we interview people and we transcribe them, then we allow them the opportunity to review the interview and polish it up. We were at a conference, Karen and I were, it was an Aboriginal Editors Conference, where there was a concern about taking out voice of community people and people coming in and editors taking away voice. But you go to the old people, the elders, if you give them a little transcript, they get quite mad. I don't talk like that. I don't write like that. So all the double negatives and all that have to go out, and it becomes a polished document in a sense. But that's what community people tell us they want. But they have the final approval over the transcript before we publish it or put it online, and that's just good community building relationships. The Virtual Museum also has a very large collection of Métis historical images as well as Métis artifact images, which are part of the Publishing Department's Museum and Gallery collection. These images are often used in our books, something which saves money and administrative time for a publishing program. It's wonderful that we have hundreds and hundreds of historical artifacts that have been digitized in our office. It's wonderful that we have Christie's paintings and Sherry Phil Rissette's paintings. If we need an image for a book, they're right in our office. We'll just talk to the artist, okay, Sherry or Christie, we'd like to use this for a project, and we just go from there. So the fact that we don't have to go around and shop so much for images is great. If you deal with a lot of archival institutions like the Glenbow in Alberta, for instance, if you have an image dense book, you know, they get to be $15 to $20 to $45 an image depending on that. So if you have over 300, 400 images, you just do the math, you know. So it's nice that we can actually do that in-house for a lot of images. Yes?
We did make a lot of money doing that, but we started asking for the context and the pages that we're going to use, either text or images in. And as soon as they're talking about us like we're in the past tense, we're Vantage culture, or they'll maybe have that slant like, well, of course the government had to, you know, put us down. We were rebelling against them. So, I mean, that's why we want to say no, because half the time it almost, maybe this is thinking we're too lofty, but we would validate their publication by allowing them to use it or having any content that we sanctioned their use of. So it's just easier to say no. It is, and of course the Institute's from a Métis perspective, right? So in my road allowance book, I will say that the CCF government of Tom McDouglas did ethnically cleanse the Métis. You know, when they burnt down Little Chicago and loaded people up on cattle cars to take them to Green Lake, that's what it was. It was that's part of our history, and that's what the community people tell us. So that'll go in the book. So we don't have to worry about upsetting people. That's an actual fact of history that our community people tell us about. Collections. The Virtual Museum has the following sections. Collections. We have a big archival collection. This section houses various archival documents relating to GDI's corporate history, as well as those of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. In case you don't know, we are the educational and cultural affiliate of Métis Nation Saskatchewan. So a lot of their primary documents we've digitized and put online as well. So if you're interested, such as Natalie and, you know, some of the social justice aspects of the Métis political movement, a lot of that stuff we have in our archives, and some of it has been digitized. In addition, this section also contains various documents and photographs relating to Métis veterans and elders, back issues of New Breed magazine, which was the Métis
cultural and political magazine in Saskatchewan that ran from about 1970 to 2010 via the Metis Society, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, and then through Gabriel Dumont Institute. New Nation magazine, which we published for a few years. We have an antique book collection where we've digitized several dozen old books and put them online. The Dennis and Jean Fisher archival collection, the Canadian Illustrated War News, we've digitized the whole run of those. Print documents and video files relating to various Métis-related conferences. The section also has interviews and video files relating to Métis leaders, activists, and authors. Paul, when he was in Saskatoon, donated his papers to the Institute, so we have some Paul Chartrand papers on the virtual museum. In the future, we'll put the Senator John Boucher papers and the Olive Dickinson papers in this section. We also have an artifact and art collection. As we mentioned earlier, GDI has an extensive Métis-specific museum collection in our publishing department office in Saskatoon. The art gallery component of the museum includes the world's largest collection of Christy Belcourt paintings, as Karen mentioned. It also has paintings by Sherry Farrell Rossette, Leah Marie Dorian, Dennis Weber, Jane Ash Poitras, and many others. The artifact component of the museum includes the Dennis and Jean Fisher collection, the Olive Dickinson collection, Cockham's Kitchen, which is really neat. Well, actually, it should be Cockham's Cabin. We recreated an old cabin that a Cockham would have lived in, say, circa 1930 and 40, right, with the wood and all the artifacts inside. We have a bunch of fur trade artifacts from the Hudson Bay Company, like fur trade crosses. Other artifacts relating to material culture, sashes, hooked rugs, beaded and embroidered moccasins, gloves, gauntlets. And what we've tried to do is we tried to show the continuation of the art form through time and place. So we'd have, say, a 100-year-old moccasin beside a more modern one. We try to show examples of embroidery, quill work, and bead work in the artifacts. And we want to show that the continuation of the culture is ongoing and that people of different genders now make this stuff, whereas in the past women made it all. So we let people who come in we let them know that this is the process we've set up. Not all of the items in our museum and art gallery have been digitized and appear on the website. This process is going to take time. We also have a biography and essay collection. This section contains several hundred biographies of Métis from both Canada and the United States. And I have to throw a plug for my old friend who's not here. This work has largely been compiled by Lawrence J. Barkwell, Métis Historical Research Coordinator of the Louis Riel Institute, and a great friend of our friend Nicholas over there. The section also contains many essays and short articles relating to various aspects of Métis history, and it also includes several academic theses that Métis academics have let us put on the virtual museum. So if you have a PhD or an MA thesis you want in the virtual museum, please let me know and I'll digitize it as per your instructions and put it on our website. We also have a big image collection. Many of the images from our published resources and those relating to our corporate history have been added to this section. Many more will be forthcoming over time. This section also houses a selection of Métis-specific photographs held by the Saskatchewan Archives Board, as well as First Nations-related photographs in the possession of the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society. We have a learning resources collection. We've digitized many of our older resources and out-of-stock resources and put them online. We also include some resources produced by Métis community members and put that in that section as well. And we have a real good Michif collection online. GDI works with Michif speakers to preserve and promote the 3 Michif languages spoken in Saskatchewan: Michif, Michif French, and Northern Michif. Now, if you're a linguist, you're not going to like me giving those labels because they will say there's only one Michif, but we use sociological reality. If a Métis person in Saskatchewan says they speak a Michif language, and since we're owned and operated by the Métis people, we will call it a Michif language. So the 3 languages that are spoken in Saskatchewan are the Standard Michif, which is a mix of French and nouns and Cree verbs. Northern French, which is almost all Cree with a tiny little bit of French nouns spoken in northwestern Saskatchewan. And Michif French, which is a type of French that has more or less an Algonquian syntax or word order, and the odd Cree or Soto word. That would be the language Paul speaks from St. Laurent, Manitoba. It was also spoken in Saskatchewan as well. We also have a section, music, dance, and community events. And this is where our fiddle, and dance, and jigging videos are. And Chris Anderson's uncle, John Arcand, the master of the Métis fiddle, he has some files there. So that's an interesting section. Oral history and traditional stories collection is another good one. This section contains the GDI's extensive oral history collection as well as the traditional Métis stories and storytelling resources. So if you're interested in traditional Métis stories, I won't call them folklore, but traditional Métis stories like Wissahicketchek and Nanabush and Chijan stories and that sort of thing. There's a bunch of resources there for you. We have an exhibit section. One of the items is that, and I'm going to butcher the name, I don't know whether it's Bungi or Bungi, but there's a language that was spoken in Manitoba, and it is an English Creole that was spoken by Métis of Scots, Orkney, and Cree and Ojibwe heritage. Essentially, it was a type of English with an Algonquian syntax as well in the odd Cree word. So it was kind of, it was a type of English, but it was a Métis English, if I might use that word, that had a Celtic tinge to it, because it also had some Celtic in it, Scots. And this collection was donated to GDI by Métis elder Iris Vitt, and her father, Frank Walters, did this collection. He was non-Aboriginal, but he was so interested in his wife's heritage that he went out and talked to people over the course of 50 years, and he made these recordings of this English dialect that was spoken by the English Métis in Red River. So as far as I know, that's the only audio files of Bungi that exist in the world that are online. So have a look at that and see what you think. One of the real special collections we have in the exhibits is the Dennis and Jean Fisher collection. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dennis and Jean Fisher, but I'll focus mostly on Dennis because the story relates heavily to him. He has a lifelong passion for Métis and First Nations peoples. He was a former president of CFQC Radio in Saskatoon, which is the CTV affiliate. He was a friend of John Diefenbaker and was one of his pallbearers. So he has this real sense of history to him. And his fascination, he grew up near Batoche, for Batoche was quite extraordinary. So over the course of the 60s and 70s, when it was legal, before Parks Canada bought the land, him, his wife, and their 3 sons, his wife Jean, went out to Batoche and they gathered artifacts, like from Gabriel Dumont's land, Gatling gun shells, like medicine bottles that the soldiers drank. Well, the medicine bottles were whiskey, but I mean, they called it medicine because here's the hypocritical thing. These English teetotaling soldiers come out, you know, they're against drinking, but they liked medicine. Well, their medicine was whiskey, and there was all these whiskey bottles, like they were all Orangemen from Ontario, but they didn't mind drinking whiskey, you know. So anyway, we have all these broken whiskey bottles, quote, medicine bottles, in our collection thanks to Dennis and Jean, but just remarkable artifacts. They went down to Montana and St. Peter's. We have some of the St. Peter's missions, some of the rocks. We have part of the Northcott that Gabriel Dumont and the Métis resistors put cables and knocked the smokestack off. And it beached in Cumberland House, Saskatchewan. So they went to Cumberland House and got a piece of the Northcott. And the Northcott, in the story I tell about the Northcott, the boat's still there, but the priest, Father Charlebois, tried to burn it down because it was a makeout point. So the priest had some community people try to burn down the Northcott, which was used to suppress the Métis resistance, but the Métis kids in Cumberland House were using it as a makeout point. So the French-Canadian priest came in with community people and tried to burn it, but he didn't get the whole thing. So we got a piece of the Northcott thanks to, and that's such an amazing piece of Canadian history. And the Gabriel Dumont book that Larry has so graciously handed out, half of that book was a result of what the Fishers donated to the Gabriel Dumont Institute, like images of some of the artwork they collected. Dennis was a master draftsman, so he would sketch some of the things he found. So his legacy was Gabriel Dumont, Le Chef Michif in images and words, as well as this vast collection. We have a nice Hudson Bay Company artifact collection. Fur trade crosses and other items. And one of the really interesting things is when you find provenance of some of these things, like fur trade crosses were given out to prominent chiefs and other people in First Nations communities in the Great Lakes area mostly, but up into the Athabasca country. But one of the interesting things is we have provenance to one of them. There was a guy named Kinsey. His father was with Wolfe at Quebec when the English beat the French. Not the Canadiens, but beat the French. That's my bit of history. And anyway, his son came with him when he was little, and he eventually became an American. And he was one of the, quote, Euro-American founders of Chicago, never mind that, there were all sorts of First Nations. I don't know what their politically correct name is, but Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, and then there were Metis, there were Canadiens there. But anyway, this Kinsey was one of the, quote, Euro-American founders of Chicago. Well, we have that fur trade cross in our office. So, that's an interesting bit of history. So that's one of the stories I like to tell people. Then, of course, the Canadian Pictorial and Illustrated War News, which was published by Grip Printing and Publishing in Toronto. And what's really cool about this section is, unlike now, there were no live action photographs. I guess Peters was the first one who actually took photographs of a battle that appeared in publications, but they didn't appear that day. They'd be weeks after the fact. So they had a lot of sketch artists sketch things. So you have images of, for instance, in my Gabriel Dumont book, where Gabriel Dumont looks like a Canadien voyageur, just a regular Jean-Baptiste type from, just in Trois-Rivières. It's really funny. And then Chief Whitecap looks like he just came from a Wyandotte Huron lodge. Their perception of what First Nations and Métis people looked like is just phenomenal. So if you're into historical images and how perceptions of people, Aboriginal people are, that's a great resource. And then we have a What's New section, which is continually updated. And I just uploaded some stuff that was given to us so generously by Evelyn Peters and Matt Stock. And those are the Edmonton, Strathcona, Winnipeg, St. Boniface Métis censuses for 1901, 1911, and 1916. So if you want to have a boo at those are remarkable documents. And then we have my good friend Norman Fleury's Michif Dictionary. The online dictionary features over 500 translations and audio pronunciations by Michif language expert Norman Fleury. A search tool allows users to look up the English word to find the Michif translations. He has Michif lessons on there that my colleague David Moran worked on to develop. There's over 1,000 words and phrases for these 60 exercise, and Norm provides the Michif translation and narration. So if you want to know what a Michif word is, I don't know, I'll give you, let's try to think of one. Sash, Métis sash. So you punch that in and Norm would say, Li Shencher Flashe. It's not quite Sensor Flashe, it's the Michif pronunciation's a little different. And then if you want something that's like walking, it'll be what the verb would be in Cree, but it'll have a Michif pronunciation, like Tanse is Cree, whereas Michif is Tanche. It's different. Just as merci is Marseille in Michif, where it's not merci. So little subtle differences, but if you know French or have an ear for Cree, you'll get the gist of what they're saying. We have Android apps for the dictionaries. They're for Android users only. We're trying to work with Apple for iPhone and iPad users, but this is taking some time. And we have another website. It's more geared for children, but it's called the Back to Patosh Interactive website. And it has a whole bunch of interactive resources for school kids. And I think that's all. Thank you. Merci tous. Can we take some questions, Chris? You want to take some questions, or you want to go?
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you, Darren, and Karen, for that very interesting overview of the resources you have at the Gabriel Dumont Institute. I think we all benefit from knowing what you have now. And I encourage everybody to take advantage of using it. We are kind of running behind, so I thought maybe we'll just get right into the reports from our various breakout groups. So any of the what are the people, the facilitators or the spokespersons from those groups, if you don't mind coming up. We'll do a quick wrap up, and then we'll call it a conference.
I don't have the notes. I just. Yeah. I don't have my notes with me. Oh well. It's like someone else that took notes. Oh, I'm not worried. I guess. Should we just start then? Okay. I'm trying to remember the. So just there was a couple of themes that came out of the group discussion we had. I'm trying to remember what there. One of the things, speaking of treaties, that came up a lot was sort of when I referred to the CWE criteria in my presentation. The two first things were the parties to the agreement and then the agency. So there's a question of who has that agency to negotiate a treaty. Does it have to be provincial organizations? Could it be like with the MMF? Could a treaty be negotiated with one of the federated regions of the MMF, or does it have to be the entire provincial organization? And that, of course, the question of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan came up. That what happens when you have something like that? Our governance structure falls apart, and that who becomes the interlocutor with the provincial and federal governments. I'm trying to remember, there was what was the second point? I've forgotten already. About the sources of law, basically. So how would those treaties be interpreted in that? So we were talking about the importance of stories and drawing law out of stories and that. So because even, again, when I refer to the CWE criteria, those are it's a very contractual idea of a treaty. And it's sort of that one-shot deal kind of thing, whereas the Indigenous perspective, it's an ongoing kinship relationship, and that. So, how would that play out if we integrate those kind of interpretations into not just in the treaty, but seeing the treaty as a relationship and as an ongoing relationship, and that. So, I'd say those were the two main themes that came out of the discussion.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jennifer. I'm happy to speak on behalf of our group, although I should say we had a little bit of a conflict. So I'll try to amalgamate best I can the key points that we got out of our discussion. There were a lot of issues actually raised, a lot of really interesting ideas and important ideas, but I'd say we can pretty much summarize what we discussed in three key areas. So I know you asked for one or two, but we were able to narrow it down to three, and those three are primarily capacity, consent, and legitimacy. So in terms of the first, capacity, in a way that's the same as participation. So some of the questions that were raised during our discussion included what is the role of members of Métis communities in the Métis treaty process. And Métis communities, in that sense, should include all members, including women, Métis women, including youth. And specifically, the issue that was raised is that the voices of all members need to be heard, and they need to be reflective of the different values that the different members have, whether those are traditional values, modern values, and so on. And so the negotiations of treaties need to reflect fully and accurately all voices in the process. And that's connected to broader issues of consent, free will, and self-determination. And so that moves into our second point, which namely is consent, and also the broader issue of interpretation. So for research purposes, questions, again, some questions that were raised included, how do we define what a treaty is? How do we interpret treaty provisions during the negotiations process? And in that context, who are the treaty parties? Who are the Métis? And of course, that has importance for Métis identities. Specifically, some of the earlier discussions that took place yesterday about the complexities that exist surrounding Métis identities, belongingness, and inclusion. And ultimately, that leads to our third and final issue that was discussed, legitimacy. And that's connected to accommodation. So in that sense, one question that was posed was whether the accommodation of various Métis rights constitute treaty agreements that will be constitutionally protected by Section 35. And that goes back to consent, once again. And ultimately the legitimacy of the process itself, which of course has implications for the honour of the Crown, the duty of the Canadian government to act honourably, and so on. So I hope that that does a fair representation of what the issues were that were raised. We had to sort of narrow things down a little bit and revise a lot, but I mean, by all means, if any of the other group members want to chime in and pick up on anything that I've left out, feel free.
So I'm a little bit reluctant because I think the conversation in our room was had very big expectations, and they ranged quite significantly. So I've tried to group them based on people's comments into 3.5 categories. And so we didn't really have we covered some of the substantive points that you guys are raising in terms of what people want to know more about treaties, but the 3 themes were sort of, or 3.5 themes. The first one was understanding treaties, and I think that here is not just understanding treaties, but in their different contexts and how context also influence treaties. So people talked about the historical context of the state, also with other Indigenous nations, and also things that hadn't been discussed in the conference, but in the urban context, and what does the treaty relationship mean within those different contexts and how context affects those treaties. And then sort of a related half point to that theme was people noted the need to expand our notion of treaty, specifically from a Métis perspective, and what is novel and different about the way in which we express treaties. And in that, there are a lot of comments about Métis legal and treaty approaches and how those were played out with other Indigenous nations and with other with colonial powers, et cetera, and crowns. So the second theme was relationship between treaties and reconciliation, and here I think we had a bit of a conversation about the political moment and sort of the context in which this project fits more generally. And here this relationship was discussed in relation to the federal and provincial crown and how that's evolved in the colonial context, but also there was the relationship between treaty and reconciliation with other Indigenous nations and how that sort of 1.5 theme influences this second understanding of reconciliation. Which brought us to our last point, which was sort of also looking forward, and sort of what could be the relevance, and how could this research project be used as a tool moving forward. And a lot of people talked about the research that's produced and some of the archival stuff that might come out of it, and how that can be used by individuals to link to community, but also to empower communities, both Métis communities, but also other Indigenous communities. And there is a lot of, I think, hope in that information might also be used by the Crowns in informing that perspective. So there was sort of that, how can this be a knowledge tool beyond the duration of the project moving forward. So I hope that captures a little bit what everybody had to say.
One small thing to that, because I know you kind of limit it to 2 or 3 points, and so I know we're kind of saying it's 3.5 points, but I just want to make a plug for the half a point, which I think is a really good point, which is that we were talking in our group too about having Métis legal approaches and looking at what are Métis legal understandings of treaty, and it would be really foundational for those projects, at least in my opinion.
Thanks.
Okay, our group came up with about 10 points, and I haven't had the benefit of being able to condense it, but I guess I can say the whole concept of who are the Métis and Métis identity was woven really throughout the entire discussion, and intersecting with that was the pitfall, or the trap of, I guess, falling into categories that are traditionally colonial in nature, and so that was kind of like was the caution, I guess, in our discussion, is that we needed to avoid that pitfall. But there was one sort of reference to how when we talk about Métis identity, we can fall into sort of various different assumptions, I think, but one that was identified in particular was this notion of being more civilized compared to First Nations, and that somehow that makes us better off. And so that was just really, I guess, addressed with the whole idea of just continuing to get the Métis story out there, and greater knowledge transfer, not creating more knowledge, but more just being true to the knowledge that is there, and transferring that to the new generations, to the younger generations. And interwoven with that, which again is related to the whole identity thing, was the whole concept of kinship. So we really struggled with the whole, kind of thread of sort of ethnic fraud versus, and being real strict around who is Métis, and acknowledging that there's community associated with it, and then the whole concept of kinship, and where does the whole history of adoption and people being disconnected from their communities, how does that fit in? And that is a real important struggle that needs to be worked out. And I think the other thing I want to just raise is the amount of work and effort that goes into being able to assert identity, and the cost of litigation, and that, just all of that being really excluding quite a lot of people. And then the corollary of that, which is how much of our money that we pay into the federal government is wasted on fighting against people having recognition and receiving their due, and so that Larry talked about that struggle that he has against himself because he's a taxpayer and a Métis. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting, and others who are here were in the group who think that there's really crucial things that I've left out. You can please feel free to speak up, because I know I did leave stuff out, and I think I was supposed to.
I think one thing that we sort of seem to is this idea of not falling into the trap that First Nations have fallen into. So the idea of, there's this whole construction, and now First Nations, and I'm a First Nation person, I'm Mohawk, we're having to deconstruct a lot of the colonial imposition upon us. So for the Métis, make no mistake, you need to think about these things. And I also, based on my own work, and that's part of what I shared, I'm looking at rethinking policy options on reconciliation in relation to resource extraction. And the politics of recognition is one discourse. And tied to that are the discourses around treaty negotiations, self-government. All these things are tied to a very colonial view. So you need to really consider these kinds of things as you go forward.
That sounds like nearing our end. Okay, thank you very much for those reports. Very much. So that basically concludes our conference. I want to give thanks to the Planning Committee, Brenda McDougall, the Chair of Métis Studies here at U of Ottawa, Professor Darren O'Toole, Professor Nicole St-Onge, and myself. No, I don't need to thank myself. Alexander Michaud, who has been very helpful in organizing the conference. Veronique LaRose, one of our staff who helped get people to the right places. And not least, the students from the Aboriginal Law Students Association. And I know Jessica's here. Anybody else here? Yeah. So a great round of applause to them, please. I had an amazing 2 days. I'm totally exhausted, in a good way. In a good way. I think I learned a lot, and I know that this will benefit the direction of our project going forward into the future. So thank you very much for your input as well.